We are going to discuss the Jeffersonians. This would be in reference to Thomas Jefferson. The Jeffersonians are those who followed his ideology, which in general is a Democratic Republican, or we formerly would have called it an anti federalist attitude, but more specifically, that are molded by the events of his presidency and are loyal to him during his time in office. So we want to make sure that by the end of this that we can summarize the impact of the westward movement on nationalism and democracy as the result of major land acquisitions such as the Louisiana Purchase. So what did buying all this land and this movement west do to our nationalism and our democracy? To what extent did Jefferson compromise his strict constructionalist principles by purchasing Louisiana? This is going to be a hot topic of conversation and then one that we will look at in a longer essay question as well. But if we define a Jeffersonian as someone who is the embodiment of democratic Republican ideals, including strict constructionism, then how was the purchase of Louisiana justified? And we'll look at some of the other things that Jefferson did as president and see if we can answer this question. Was Jefferson Jeffersonian? So who was he? Well, he's a Democratic Republican. He's president from 1801 until 1809. So he serves 2 terms. He is a Virginia plantation owner and a slave owner, and we've referenced Sally Hemings before. He's the co-author of the Declaration of Independence, the governor, a minister to France, a secretary of state, vice president, and president. So he really sort of covers all his bases there. He is a founding member of the Democratic Republicans, and as such, he stands in stark contrast to Hamilton, to John Adams, and the other Federalists. However, this quote at the bottom here is significant, I think. He says, "Every difference of opinion is not a difference of principle. We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists." Substitute, Democrat for in Republican here, and I don't know if you hear this sentiment expressed as often today. So, although Jefferson certainly saw himself in opposition to people like Hamilton and Adams and even George Washington at times, he still considered them to be sort of all working together in this American experiment. So who are we? So just a few slides that are going to position us, give us some context to what's going on in the United States. We are seeing a rapid growth of cities, but as rapid as that growth is, it's still only about 7% of the U.S. population. So we are still a primarily agrarian society. Agrarian is just farming, right? Agricultural. So that is who Thomas Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans, that's going to be their base. They're going to appeal most to that group. And that is going to be sort of the largest population base here also. There is a fear, among others, of the immigration and overcrowding that is occurring. And a lot of this immigration and overcrowding is occurring because of wars in Europe. So think about the aftermath of the French Revolution. Think about the Napoleonic Wars, what Napoleon is doing over in Europe. A lot of people are fleeing. You also have the Industrial Revolution that is happening around this time period, leading to overcrowding of urban areas in Europe. So people coming to looking for better living and working conditions in the United States as early as this Jeffersonian era. There are greater differences between the rich and the poor. That gap is going to be continuing to widen. Free African Americans, free blacks, are moving to cities. And cities are going to be the center of manufacturing and shipping, which is a very large industry. As the large populations grow in the United States, it is going to provide both a market for goods and also a market or a labor force to work in the manufacturing industry. However, people are still hoping to make money in order to buy land. During this time, you don't really have people going to the city and saying, I'm going to, buy the biggest row house I can in this town. They are saying, I'm going to move to the city, I'm going to work in this manufacturing industry, and then I'm going to go west and seek my fortune, or go back to the south and buy more land. So power and money is still going to be concentrated with those who have the most land. And that will shift, right? That will change. But for now, that's still where we are. It's a young population. In 1820, half of the population is under the age of 20, which seems ridiculous, but it's true. In the upper class, you tended to have smaller families, your health was better, and you had a lower infant mortality rate. And the small families are intentional. So you're starting, you don't need to have 10 kids anymore to help you work a farm if you live in a more urban area. The poor continue to have more children, but also smaller families because not as many of their children survived childhood. Women, we are still in this time period of Republican motherhood. The idea that, well, women don't need, political and economic rights, but they do have this moral superiority. It's because it's their responsibility to raise children with these principles of democracy and republicanism, et cetera, et cetera. The Second Great Awakening is going on during this time period. We talked pretty extensively about the First Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening is really going to take place in this context of romanticism that's sweeping the whole world during this time period. And it's really going to focus on a personal relationship with God. This idea that although, we did have the First Great Awakening, years and years ago, now we've become too focused on an established church. And instead of that, we need to focus on our personal relationship with God. It's against establishment elites. And it's really going to be focused on this sort of big tent revivalism. So you have preachers that would tour around the country. Specifically, the Methodists did this, and they would host these revivals under these tents. People would come see, and you see a lot of Methodists, you see a lot of Baptists, and you also see the rise of different groups like Mormons. You see Joseph Smith, who is going to be forced to move all the way out to the Utah, right, in Salt Lake City, because nobody else would want the land that he eventually settled. Let's see what else I want to mention about this. Women, 70 to 80% of new church members are women, and they also attract a really large population of African Americans as well. And this is also typical of the events of the First Great Awakening. You have growing commerce, which I've mentioned. You have more banks due to Alexander Hamilton's successful plan for a national bank. There is a war in Europe, and so the United States is having to figure out how it's going to navigate that diplomatically. The embargo of 1807 is going to be something that we discuss in a little bit. This desire to extend transportation out west. Ultimately, in the future, we'll be talking about things like the Transcontinental Railroad. But right now, it's things like, steamboats and the Erie Canal and Lewis and Clark. Let's see, there's a little picture of interchangeable parts, this idea of a growth of industry and the American system of manufacturing, which specifically is going to focus on specialization and mass production. There's also something called the putting out system, which is a piecework system. So families in their home would do one part of the process and then pass the second part of the process to a different either family, household, or a larger manufacturing center. You have steam engines, machine tools, the growth of patents. This is also going to be the start of the formation of regional identities. So we're now not just colonies, we are southern colonies or we are northern colonies, and everybody is going to have their own sort of personality. In the Northeast, we see a lack of self-sufficiency. They have to trade, they have to be dependent on their neighbor because they don't have large-scale agriculture in the Northeast, like we see in the middle colonies in the South. And so they need people to buy the goods that their manufacturing centers are producing. Remember, they're also a center of shipbuilding, and so they need to make sure that they have access to trade as well. In the South, though, we have King Cotton, 40% of U.S. exports by 1810. That's cotton. Eli Whitney and the cotton gin is going to spur the need for more slaves in the South, or at least the perceived need of more slaves in the South. And you also, even within the South, start to see a distinction between the personality of the Upper South and the personality of the Lower South. It also mentions here some things about compromises, which we'll be talking more about, but the idea that slavery is still going to be an issue as we're admitting new states. Are they going to be a slave state? Are they going to be a free state? That's something that's already having an impact in American life and in American politics. So what does it mean to be Jeffersonian? It means that you value republicanism, that you value civic duty, and that you want to shift as much of the decision-making to the people as possible. However, although they believe in voting and they believe in a right to education, Jeffersonians, including Thomas Jefferson himself, also believed in something called natural elites, that there were people who were naturally better than others. So the large plantation owners shouldn't lose political power to the smaller farmers, for example. They favored agriculture over manufacturing industry, and they believed very strongly in that. They believed that dependence on others led to class conflict and that you should be self-sufficient. And remember, we just said the Northeast was not self-sufficient. In terms of society, they believed in Republican motherhood. They believed that Native Americans were capable of learning to be good Republicans, but that they needed some serious education in order to catch up. It's that idea of Jacques Rousseau, the noble savage that we've discussed, that they were somehow primitive but also better at the same time. They believed in Black inferiority and white superiority and separation of church and state. They also believed they were anti-federalists at heart, right? So the ultimate sovereignty should lie in the states, and that the states had the power of nullification. Nullification means that if a state thought that a federal law was unconstitutional, that they could just refuse to follow it, that they could declare it null within their state. Jefferson and the Jeffersonians considered themselves to be strict constitutionalists. So if it's not specifically stated in the Constitution, they don't want anything to do with it. They want the legislature to be the dominant branch. They want to have a very weak judiciary. And they prefer diplomacy to the build-up of the military. Jefferson, in particular, believed in the idea of the yeoman farmer as the ideal citizens. So he would be an example of that he was a hardworking guy in his own mind, that he had sort of pulled himself up by his bootstraps, that he owned a large amount of land, that he was a gentleman, and that those are the kinds of citizens that the United States should be cultivating. And he also kept up with the George Washington warning to avoid entangling in foreign alliances. Here's his comment on the separation of church and state. He says, I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people, which declared that their legislature should, quote, make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state. He said his goal was to shrink the federal government, to repeal federalist legislation, to educate the citizens, to create peace among nations, to cut the debt, and to expand. Now, those two things are in caps because those were very important ideas to him. Cutting the debt is very Jeffersonian. Expanding is sort of up for debate. But if you believe that the yeoman farmer is the backbone of this country, then you want to get as much land as possible to create as many yeoman farmers as possible. So again, cut the debt and expand is in there twice because it's so important. He wanted to repeal all direct taxes, which would help farmers. A direct tax is a tax on you as a person. So an income tax is direct tax, right? You are being taxed, as opposed to a tax on a good or service, like the Whiskey Rebellion. We talked about excise taxes. So a direct tax is a tax on you. It would help farmers, but it would hurt the people in the Northeast because they're more reliant on having to, trade and purchase. They're less self-sufficient. He wanted to reduce the size of the Navy, really eliminate it altogether, because remember, diplomacy over militarism. And he also wanted to create a cabinet that was supportive. Remember, Jefferson was a member of Washington's cabinet, but he didn't necessarily share the political views that Washington did. And Jefferson saw that as a problem in terms of the way that Washington governed. So he wanted to create a cabinet that was loyal to him and to his ideas. The election of 1880 is a lot of times called a revolution, the Revolution of 1880, because it represents a shift from the Federalist majority to the Democratic-Republican majority. It's going to be Thomas Jefferson as president, and this is also going to be the election that prompts the adoption of the 12th Amendment. It's going to be adopted in time for the 1804 election. It still provides for the House of Representatives to choose in the event that the electors can't choose a majority, but the vice president and the president are going to be elected on two separate ballots. So it ensures that if Democratic Republicans have the majority across the board, then that both the president and the vice president would be of the same party. The Judiciary Act of 1801 is going to expand the legislature. Adams is going to, at the last minute, appoint a lot of Federalist judges that Jefferson is going to have a huge problem with. And so we're going to see some back and forth there. We have a few different really important Supreme Court cases to look at. And so I want to make sure that you have your Supreme Court case sheet that's in the resources folder. Make sure you have that out and that you're starting to look at cases like Marbury v. Madison and Fletcher v. Peck. Marbury v. Madison of 1803 establishes the principle of judicial review. This is the court of John Marshall. He's going to be Chief Justice from 1801 until 1835. He's a Federalist appointed by Adams, and he believes very strongly in having a Federalist-style national government, so a strong national government. Marbury v. Madison is going to establish the principle that the court can strike down a law so that the judicial branch can be a check on the legislative branch, okay? Fletcher v. Peck is a case in 1810, and it's going to be the first case that establishes the precedent that the federal court can strike down a state law. And I'm going to play a short little video here for you that will hopefully explain that.
Hi, I'm Craig, and this is Crash Course Government and Politics, and today we're going to talk about the most important case the Supreme Court ever decided, ever. No stand that Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company versus Sawyer, although that is one of my favorites. Loves me some sheet and tube. And no, it's not ex parte queerin', although I do love me some inept Nazi spies and submarines. And no, it is not Miller v. California. Get your mind out of the gutter, Stan. We could play this game all day, but this episode is about judicial review, the most important power of the Supreme Court and where it came from. Don't look so disappointed. This is cool. When you think of the Supreme Court, the first thing you think about, other than those comfy robes, is the power to declare laws unconstitutional. The term for this awesome power, the main check that the court has on both the legislative and executive branches, is judicial review. Technically, judicial review is the power of the judiciary to examine and invalidate actions undertaken by the legislative and executive branches of both the federal and state governments. It's not the power to review lower court decisions. That's appellate jurisdiction. Most people think of judicial review as declaring laws unconstitutional, and that definition is okay. But legal purists will quibble with you since judicial review applies to more than just laws. Appellate courts, both state and federal, engage in some form of judicial review, but we're concerned here with the federal courts, especially the U.S. Supreme Court. The court has the power to review the following. 1. Congressional laws, aka statutes. Since judicial review is a form of appellate activity, it involves upholding or affirming the validity of laws, or denying it, invalidating the law in question. You might think that the Supreme Court does this a lot, but it doesn't, and historically it almost never happened before the 20th century. If the court were always striking down congressional statutes, statutes, it would be hard for people to know which laws to follow, and you'll remember one of the main things that courts do is create expectations and predictability. For instance, you could predict that I would eventually be punching this eagle. Another reason why they don't invalidate laws often is that if the court frequently overruled Congress, the court would seem too political and people would stop trusting its judgment. If the court has any power at all, it largely stems from its prestige and reputation for being impartial and above politics. No one has any problems with the Supreme Court decisions at all. 2. The court can also overturn state actions, which include the laws passed by state legislatures and the activities of state executive bureaus, usually the police. The power to review and overturn states comes from the Supremacy Clause in the Constitution. Most of the time that the Supreme Court extends civil rights, it comes out of a state action. A good example is Brown versus Board of Education, where the court struck down the idea of separate accommodations being equal in the context of state public schools. 3. The court can review the actions of federal bureaucratic agencies, although it will usually defer to the bureaucrat's expertise if the action is consistent with the intent of the legislature, which the court usually finds it is. The court almost never strikes down congressional delegation of power to the executive, although you might think that it should. The fourth area where the court exercises judicial review is over presidential actions. The court tends to defer to the president, especially in the area of national security. The classic example of the court overturning executive action happened in U.S. versus Nixon, where the justices denied the president's claim of executive privilege and forced him to turn over his recordings relating to the Watergate scandal. More recently, the court placed limits on the president's authority to deny habeas corpus to suspected terrorists in Rasool versus Bush. So, the Supremacy Clause gives the court the authority to rule on state laws, but where exactly in the Constitution does the power of judicial review come from? Trick question! It's not there. Go ahead, look. I'll wait. See? Not there. Wow, you went through that whole thing really quickly. Fast reader. The crazy thing is that the power of judicial review comes from the court itself. How? Let's go to the thought bubble. The Supreme Court granted itself the power of judicial review in the case of Marbury versus Madison. You really should read the decision because it's a brilliant piece of politics. The upshot of the case was that Chief Justice John Marshall ruled that the court had the power to review, uphold, and strike down executive actions pursuant to the Judiciary Act of 1789, and in doing this, to strike down part of that federal law. How he got there was pretty cool. So Marbury was an official that President John Adams, at the very end of his term, appointed to the position of Justice of the Peace. When Marbury went to get his official commission certifying that he could start his job, James Madison, who was Secretary of State, refused to give it to him. So Marbury did what any self-respecting petitioner would do. He went to the Supreme Court for a writ of mandamus that would force Madison to give Marbury his job. This is what he was supposed to do, according to the Judiciary Act of 1789. What Marshall did was brilliant. He ruled that, yes, Marbury had a right to the commission, but that the Supreme Court could not grant his writ because the law directing them to do so was unconstitutional. This is brilliant for 2 reasons. First, by the time the case came before the court, Thomas Jefferson was president. Those of you who remember Crash Course U.S. history will recall that less handsome man told you that Jefferson was a Democratic Republican, while Adams, Marbury, and even Marshall were all Federalists. By ruling against his own party, Marshall made a decision that was favorable to Jefferson, and thus likely to be supported. The second move is even cooler. Marshall's ruling took the power to grant writs of mandamus away from the court, making it look weaker, while at the same time giving the court the power to declare the law that had granted it the mandamus power in the first place unconstitutional. So by weakening the court in this instance, like Daredevil going blind as a kid, Marshall made it much stronger for the future, like Daredevil getting stronger in the future. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So that's where judicial review comes from, but that still leaves many questions. A big question is, why has this ruling stuck around and hasn't been overturned by other laws or later court decisions? Another question is judicial review a violation of separation of powers? Some say that it's judges making laws, and thus an anti-democratic usurpation of the legislature's power. Let's talk about this ruling's longevity first. Remember when I said last time that the Supreme Court rulings are binding in lower courts? You don't remember, do you? You were sleeping. Wake up! Well, in general, Supreme Court precedents are binding on future Supreme Courts, too, because of the principle of stare decisis, which is Latin for let the decision stand. This doesn't mean that future Supreme Courts can never overturn the decisions of prior courts. It's just that they try very hard to not do it. This idea of precedent is one way that judges can be said to make laws. Appellate decisions are like common law in that they're binding on future courts and constrain their decisions, and because they don't have to be grounded in a specific statute. Other courts have to follow the higher court's interpretation of the law, and this interpretation has the effect of redefining the law without actually rewriting the statute. On the other hand, appellate decisions are technically not common law in that they are only binding on courts, not executive agencies or legislatures. They are, however, signals to courts and legislatures about how courts will rule in the future. Maybe an example will help. If you watch cop shows or you get arrested a lot, you probably know something about Miranda versus Arizona, which gave us the Miranda warning. You have the right to remain silent and all that stuff. Hopefully you've never heard that in person, though. But hey, we're not here to judge. That's what the courts are for. Okay. In that case, the Supreme Court threw out Miranda's conviction because he hadn't been told that he had the right to remain silent. Without knowing that he didn't have to talk, he made a confession that got him convicted. The court didn't rewrite Arizona's law, but it sent a signal to Arizona's law enforcement agencies, and those in all the other states, that in the future, courts would throw out the convictions of defendants who hadn't been informed of their rights. As a result, police procedures changed in every state, and now the police are supposed to read the Miranda rights to anyone they arrest. So those are the very basics of judicial review. We've probably raised as many questions as we've answered, but that's why we're making a bunch of these videos, so we can teach it all. All of it! Anyway, the big concern for many is that cases like Marbury versus Madison, which give courts the power to strike down pieces of legislation, overturn the judgment of the elected representatives that made the laws and violate the idea of separation of powers. Well, that is a thorny issue, but it's one we don't have time to de-thorn today. For now, understand that judicial review is how the courts work in practice, and not necessarily a defined power granted by the Constitution. Just remember, the executive and legislative branches also operate with a lot of implied powers that aren't explicitly granted to them in the Constitution. That's because the governance of the United States has evolved and changed over time to hopefully suit the needs of the country as they change over time. Thanks for watching.
Okay, so Marbury v. Madison and judicial review. Back up to Adams' midnight judges. When John Adams, right before he leaves and Jefferson comes in this revolution or election of 1800, Adams is going to sort of stack all of the courts with Federalist-minded judges. And Jefferson and his Democratic Republican allies want to do what they can to get rid of those allies. And so one of the things that they do is they get rid of some lower courts that had a lot of Federalist judges. And there are then questions about what to do with those justices. Should they be allowed to stick around? In what capacity? And it's going to lead to two impeachments. One is a guy named John Pickering, who is a justice who is going to be successfully impeached on the grounds of essentially drunken behavior on the bench and some bad rulings. Samuel Chase is and he's going to be removed. Samuel Chase is going to be impeached, but not removed, because he is going to be impeached on the grounds of making bad rulings. But essentially, by failing to remove him from office, we're sending a message that, judges don't want to kick out or congressmen don't want to remove justices just for making decisions that they don't agree with, regardless of party. So this is a point where the leadership of the Democratic Republicans doesn't really match the political will of the rest of the Democratic Republicans, if that makes sense. Okay, the Barbary Pirates. This is an event that leads to, you remember when we said that Jefferson wants to cut the debt, he wants to expand, he favors diplomacy over militarization, and so he wants to essentially get rid of the Navy. He thinks the Navy is a waste of money. And the Barbary Pirates are a group, you see that map in the bottom right corner, that's the Barbary Coast. And there were a lot of piracy in those waters that essentially was trying to intercept trade and to cause a lot of financial headaches for the United States. When the colonies were part of Britain ran interference for them, right? But now that they're on their own, the Barbary Pirates deal directly with the United States. And they were extracting like 20% of the U.S.'s yearly expenditures were going to pay off the Barbary Pirates so that they would leave them alone. Jefferson's like, that's ridiculous. We're going to stop paying them. And instead, we're going to increase patrols. Well, this is going to sort of force Jefferson to admit that maybe he was wrong about the Navy, and he's going to increase the size of the Navy. Essentially, it creates more conflict, more violent conflict, and Jefferson will finally agree to pay $60,000 for the whole problem to go away. Having also, again, in the process, increased the size of the Navy, even though he said that he would not. And that's something to think about when we talk about was Jefferson Jeffersonian. Okay, the Jeffersonian economic model is very important. He believed that the United States, remember the yeoman farmer being the ideal citizen, that the U.S. should be focused on agricultural production and not raw materials, that we should get our raw materials from Europe, and that we should get our finished goods from Europe and ship our raw materials to Europe. So this right here is the Jeffersonian economic model. In pursuit of that is the Louisiana Purchase. So in 1803, Jefferson and others are going to negotiate for Louisiana with Napoleon, who really just sort of wants out. They lose Haiti. They're having some struggles. The land in Louisiana isn't really doing them any good, and so sell it, right? So why does Jefferson want it? Well, that economic model that I just showed you, this theory of the importance of agrarian expansion, the port of New Orleans. Let's see. We talked about Haiti. Here's a little, okay, so the video that I'm going to play is going to discuss how Jefferson was able to buy foreign land. And the answer is because of Article 2, Section 2, which I think is on the next slide. I'll play this real quick and then we'll go forward. It's pretty short.
Have you heard the one about Thomas Jefferson and the Louisiana Territory? Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence, was not a fan of the new Constitution presented in 1787. He was very worried that the Constitution gave too much power to the new national government and not enough power to the states, an issue known as big government. Jefferson only reluctantly agreed to support it when his friend James Madison promised to propose a Bill of Rights after it was ratified. But Jefferson's fears about big government did not go away. For example, Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton proposed a national bank in 1790, and Jefferson knew there was no provision in the Constitution to permit such a thing. Hamilton claimed some sort of implied powers mumbo-jumbo. Sure, it wasn't written in the Constitution, but the Constitution implied that it could be done. But Jefferson wasn't buying it. Nonetheless, the bank was established by Hamilton and President Washington. When Jefferson was sworn in as president in 1801, he pledged to reduce the size and scope of the national government. But of course, things didn't go exactly as he had planned. Spain secretly transferred the Louisiana Territory to France right beneath Jefferson's nose. When Congress found out, they quickly began discussions with France to buy a piece of the territory along the Mississippi River for about $2 million. But there was one little problem. Jefferson knew there was no provision in the Constitution to buy foreign territory. So what was a strict constructionist to do? First, he tried to get an amendment to the Constitution passed that would expressly permit the purchase, but Congress wasn't willing to do it. Then, without permission, the U.S. negotiators in France cut a deal for all of the territory for a cool $15 million. That new land doubled the size of the nation. Now Jefferson was really stuck. He knew that the territory would be a great acquisition for the country, providing lots of new land for farmers and other settlers, but how could he constitutionally justify it? In the end, Jefferson turned to the argument used by his old foe, Alexander Hamilton. He claimed that the power to purchase the territory is implied in the Constitution's treaty-making power. This was the exact argument that he had mocked openly a decade before, so it must have crushed his pride to have to use it. But more importantly, he may have committed the biggest big government play ever. How ironic is it that one of the biggest opponents of big government doubled the size of the young country and did so while openly questioning its constitutionality? At $15 million, which is about 3 cents an acre, it has been called by many the greatest real estate deal in the history of the United States.
So again, is Jefferson Jeffersonian? So the argument for, of course, is that it would equal greater U.S. power, again, in a time where land is power. The purchase, again, like it says, doubles the size of the United States. France needs money to fund their war with Great Britain, and so it really does go for a song. You can see there are still some disputed areas that remain. This is going to be down there in the pink right there. Spain is going to be disputing that territory, and that will be something that the U.S. will have to deal with in later treaties. So I really want you to think about why Jefferson departed from his strict constructionist view, and if you think it makes him less of a Jeffersonian because he used the whole Article 2, Section 2, the implied powers, or if it made him more of a Jeffersonian because of the idea of the yeoman farmer and agrarian expansion. Now that we have more land, we need to map the Louisiana Territory, we need to explore trade routes in the Louisiana Territory, establish an American presence there, try to reach as far west as possible, look for this Northwest Passage, et cetera, et cetera. So here he's going to turn to Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, and they are going to in turn use a young girl. She's like 16 at the time. She is going to be Sacagawea. She will be a guide and interpreter for them. She, as a young child, was actually sold to some Native Americans in the East, and so she actually spoke the language of Native Americans in the West, so she was a big help for them. The Northwest Passage, again, is something that's interesting for later explorers. The Northwest Passage is a water route, a sea route between the Atlantic and the Pacific to, again, try to help with trade, and also the idea of settling the Pacific Northwest. Because of their map making, more settlers are able to push west, increasing tensions with the Native Americans that already live there. Again, I want to remind you, why are they doing this? This is the Jeffersonian economic model. It is so important that we understand it and understand why it's Jeffersonian. So because of his popularity, he is going to get a second term. And I do want you to think, look at where he is when he runs for office. For a second time. Look at how much more territory there is in the United States. And so what is he going to be able to do with a second term? And again, overwhelming popularity for Democratic Republicans. All right. In Europe, we have the Napoleonic Wars. Britain and France are fighting, and they've been fighting for years, right? This is a Napoleon thing that you guys might remember from world history or European history. During the Napoleonic Wars, it was an observed practice that some Navy men in the British Navy would desert. They would actually get onto American merchant ships or sometimes naval vessels, and they would say, we don't want to fight anymore. And the Americans would say, come on board, absolutely, we will sort of protect you here. The British don't like that. And so they would sort of get back at the United States by taking American merchant members and putting them on British ships, and it's called impressment. They are now part of the British Navy, and you have to fight for us. They say, you take 2 of ours, we take 2 of yours. And there is an incident on the USS Chesapeake where a British ship boards the USS Chesapeake and demands to search for missing British soldiers that they say have defected or whatever. And there's violence between the 2 ships. Jefferson is horrified, and it's going to lead to the Embargo Act of 1807. The idea behind the Embargo Act is that it's going to prohibit American ships from trading in all foreign ports. But it is going to really hurt Americans more than it hurts the British, be really unpopular. There's going to be a few more years of embargoes, and finally we'll have the War of 1812. Reach out to me with any questions.